welcome to this month's GKW Safety Training Meeting. This month we are talking about silica dust. Well, what a difference a year makes. This was the first training I did a year ago. We did it in person. We've since gone online with our trainings to better distribute the training to all of our employees and also able to be more efficient with our time with these trainings. Last year when I did this training, I was using secondhand information that we had purchased from a vendor that was providing us the information about silica dust training. This year, I went to the OSHA standard text, which is 1926.1153, and read it directly from the text. So this year, the training comes as best as I can straight from the OSHA standard text. Employee training on silica needs to include the health hazards of silica, specific tasks you will perform as an employee that will expose you to silica hazards, specific measures your employer has implemented, such as work practices, engineering controls, and administrative controls to help control your exposure to respirable silica, respirators to be used, medical surveillance program, and the identity of the competent person designed by the employee to help you protect yourself against silica hazards. Let's look at some definitions that will be used throughout this video. HEPA means High Efficiency Particulate Air Filter. It means a filter that is at least 99.97% efficient at removing particles of 0.03 micrometers in diameter. PLHCP means Physician or Licensed Healthcare Professional. APF, Assigned Protection Factor, comes into play when we're talking about respirators. APF-10 respirators, also are known as N95, P95, R95, or half-mask respirator. Respirable crystalline silica is the combination of silicon and oxygen that creates quartz. Quartz then is heated through different processes to create cristobalite and tridymite. Here's a picture of exposed aggregate in a sample of concrete. You can see in between the cement there are pieces of different colors of stone. These stones are all made of quartz, either the cristobalite or the trimidiite, which are sources of respirable crystalline silica. Any building material that you work with will be a source of potential silica that you can breathe. Part of the requirements is that the employer shall ensure that at least the following hazards are addressed: lung effects, immune system effects, cancer, silicosis, and kidney effects. Let's walk through each one of these. First, the lung effects. The source of all of the problems, when you breathe in silica, it begins to scar the tissue inside the lungs. When you scar the tissue inside your lungs with these sharp pieces of silica dust, the scar tissue no longer absorbs oxygen. That leads to something called pulmonary fibrosis. Pulmonary fibrosis is the scarring of lung tissue, which then leads to other chronic health problems, one of which is COPD. With COPD, the lungs produce a fluid to prompt the healing of the scar tissue. But because it's scarred, the lungs cannot heal, so you have this fluid that continues to build up your lungs because your body is trying to heal itself, but can never fully heal the damage done by the silica. That produces a never-ending bronchitis, or a chronic bronchitis. How does this then affect your immune system? Pulmonary fibrosis increases the risks of lung diseases. Because the scar tissue in the lungs doesn't absorb oxygen anymore, the body stops protecting those unused lung cells. This then produces what's called an immunosuppressive microenvironment. The body is no longer protecting these cells, and so then infections are more common in these scarred lung tissue cells. Tuberculosis is one very serious infection that can happen in this immunosuppressive microenvironment in your lungs. Also, because the body is no longer protecting these lung cells, cancer can then develop in the lung cells. Another result of breathing silica dust is silicosis. Silicosis starts with the scarring inside the lungs from the sharp pieces of silica being breathed in and the scar tissue not absorbing oxygen. But what silicosis does is it causes you to not be able to inhale enough oxygen to properly function in your body. So you have a shortness of breath constantly. It can lead to a cough, but that lack of oxygen causes the heart to try to overcompensate for the lack of oxygen. This leads to the heart muscle enlarging, which can then lead to heart disease and heart attack. Finally, the kidney effects. Because the body is not made to ingest it, it's not meant to be in the cells. The silica then gets filtered out in the kidneys. Kidney disease can be a result of inhaling silica, which then is absorbed through the lung tissue, gets into the bloodstream, and then the kidneys have to filter that silica out. So if you're having problems, see a specialist. If your PLHCP, your doctor, orders a chest x-ray, make sure it has a B-reader chest x-ray. And if it has a rating of 1/0 or higher, then there is evidence of possible silicosis. If your PLHCP refers you to see a specialist, you need to see that specialist. Within 30 days, a specialist will explain to you the results of the medical examination. Let's talk about how we're exposed to silica dust in our work activities. Anytime you're dealing with mortar, stone, brick, or block, and you grind, drill, cut, chip, or mix, silica will be present. Anytime you use any of these power tools, a hand power saw, rotary hammer drills, powered chipping tools, or handheld grinders, you will be exposed to respirable silica dust. To mitigate your exposure to respirable silica dust when you're using a hand power saw, use the integrated water delivery system that continuously feeds water to the blade. When you're using this outdoors, if you're using under 4 hours and you're using water, then you do not need the respirator. But if you're using it over 4 hours, you do need to continue to wear your APF10 respirator. This is 4 hours of continual use. There is, as far as I know, no job that we will ever do that requires you to use a concrete saw 4 hours or more continuously. We use it occasionally to cut stone, block, or brick. Whenever you use a concrete saw indoors or in an enclosed area, an APF10 is required. If you're using a rotary hammer drill, dust collection systems are necessary. The dust collection systems that are used are either a shroud or a cowling attached to a HEPA filtered vacuum. This also applies to chipping hammers, and an APF10 respirator will be required when using a rotary hammer drill or a chipping hammer. Very important tool to mention is grinders for mortar removal. The shroud and dust collection system can be attached to the grinder when removing mortar. The grinder being used for mortar removal produces the most silica dust of any tool. Grinding mortar, which has the most silica in it, more than stone or block or brick, and because of this, you need to be wearing an APF10 always. If you are using a grinder for mortar removal over 4 hours, then you need an APF25 respirator. This is what an APF25 respirator looks like. And so something we can do as your employer to help protect you from silica dust is to have you not be using these tools more than 4 hours consecutively in a shift. If you're using a grinder for mortar removal more than 30 days, which is 6 weeks of 5 weekdays within a year, then you need to be a part of a medical testing program every 6 months. If you're not grinding more than 30 days a year, then you can be tested once every 3 years. The employer is also responsible for medical monitoring. And medical monitoring includes a medical and work history of past, present, and anticipated exposure to respirable crystalline silica, a physical examination with special emphasis on the respiratory system, a chest x-ray, a pulmonary function test with forced vital capacity, and the testing for latent tuberculosis infection are a part of this medical monitoring program. As a result of medical monitoring, you will receive a written medical report. The results of the medical examination will be presented to you within 30 days of your exam. Results of the medical exam will also inform you of any medical condition or any limitations that you should apply to your work, such as use of a respirator beyond what is the minimum standard, or perhaps prohibiting any exposure whatsoever to silica dust. The employee and the employer will both get a copy of the written medical report. So when it comes to silica dust, how much is too much? The action level is 25 micrograms per cubic meter. I like to call this the white glove test. If you can wipe your finger across a surface and pick up dust, that is 25 micrograms per cubic meter. At the 25 micrograms per cubic meter threshold, you need to start taking action to protect yourself. You are not allowed to be exposed without PPE to a level of silica dust of 50 micrograms per cubic meter. I did some research into trying to understand these quantities. The threshold for smelling the silent but deadly fart is 25 to 50 micrograms per cubic meter. So when you're in a room full of people and all of a sudden you smell that odor, that level of particulate matter is 25 to 50 micrograms per cubic meter. So you don't even need to see it. If you can feel it, smell it, touch it, taste it, if you can sense silica dust at all. That is too much silica dust, and you must protect yourself. Employer is responsible for measuring and record keeping of silica dust levels in the workplace. Let's talk about some housekeeping practices that can help us be protected against silica dust. Do not dry sweep or dry brush silica dust. Use wet sweeping so it doesn't push it into the air so then you can breathe it. Or instead of sweeping, you can use a HEPA filtered vacuum. Vacuum up the silica dust. Do not use compressed air to clean off your clothing or surfaces, as these will put the silica dust into the air to be breathed and create a hazard. Also, do not use a leaf blower to clean up silica dust, as that would also scatter the silica dust into the air. Finally, leave work at work. Make sure that the silica dust that you carry home on your clothing is removed before you enter your house. Hug your kids, hug your wife. Dust is then released from your body around them. Silica dust also is one of those hazards that can change an enclosed space into confined space. Enclosed areas become confined spaces when any other hazard is present. An enclosed space has limited exits. If you add another hazard to it, it becomes a confined space. Silica dust is one such hazard. So in those cases where you are in a space with limited exits and you're working with silica dust, you need to have ventilation to minimize the accumulation of visible airborne dust. You also need to have an escape plan if the dust becomes too much for you to see or breathe, that you can get out quickly. You also need to have a space attendant. A space attendant is simply someone outside of the enclosed or confined space who knows you are there, who can rescue you from that situation if you are incapacitated. Let's talk about PPE, or personal protective equipment. If dust collection or wet work is not available, an APF respirator is required. Additional protections are needed if exposure exceeds 4 hours. An APF 25 respirator, which is a PAPR, powered air purifying respirator, will be needed if you're using certain tools over 4 hours. Let's talk about who our competent person is at GKW. A competent person is someone who knows the hazards, is able to anticipate hazards, and has stop work authorization. If you've watched this video, you now know the hazards of silica dust. So you are responsible to identify hazards when they exist. Because you now know the hazards and the sources of these hazards, you are also able to anticipate the hazards. So you are responsible to anticipate respirable crystalline silica hazards. And because every GKW employee has the authority to stop work if a hazard exists and they are not controlled. If people are using grinders and do not have the respirator on, you can stop the work and make sure work doesn't proceed until everyone is appropriately protected. Let's review. Breathing silica dust can lead to lung damage, infections, tuberculosis, lung cancer, COPD, silicosis, heart and kidney disease, and death. Silica dust is produced from cutting or grinding brick, block, stone, or the aggregate in cement. Tools which may produce silica dust are handheld power saws, rotary hammer drills, powered chipping tools, and handheld grinders. Engineering controls to reduce dust include wet cutting or the use of a HEPA vacuum system with dust collection shroud or cowling. Do not sweep or brush silica dust. Do not use air to blow away silica dust. Use wet sweeping or a HEPA vacuum to clean up silica dust. Your employer is responsible for silica testing and treatment. If your doctor orders you to have a chest x-ray, your employer should be informed so they can monitor and keep records. A respirator with at least an APF 10 is required whenever airborne silica dust is produced to the amount of 50 micrograms per cubic meter of air. You are responsible for being a competent person. You are responsible to identify these hazards, anticipate when the hazards might be produced, and to stop work if someone is working in an unsafe manner. Thank you for attending this silica dust training with GKW. There will be an exam. The purpose of the exam is mostly to record your attendance. Click on the link below, give your name, email address, and your phone number, and answer the questions. This will record your attendance to this GKW safety training meeting.